It really is stunning. I don't know. It seems to be, is it waning? I have not watched any cable news, so I don't really have a sense of whether or not it is. But as of yesterday, Ebola now ranks among the top 10 issues America's considered to be the most important ones facing the country. Still ranks behind 5 other issues, including the economy, dissatisfaction with government, unemployment, and ties several others. This is from a Gallup poll, but now that was a week ago. Who knows? But it's been unbelievable to watch how this has been hyped and how much it has woven itself into the fabric of about a half dozen Republican Senate wannabes' talking points. Also now, we hear from the Christian right, a group called the Children of God for Life, put out a press release announcing that several Ebola vaccines in development for use worldwide are made using fetal cell lines. I don't know if you guys were old enough to remember the debates about embryonic stem cell research, where George Bush said basically there'd be no further federal funding of this.
I remember that.
Well, the Children of God for Life say it's completely irresponsible of this administration to put these problem vaccines on fast track for approval and ignore the fact that a massive number of people may very well refuse them. Why not fast track a product that everyone can use in good conscience? So in other words, why not inhibit the development of this vaccine so that some of us who have a bizarre, and it is bizarre, folks, none of these fetuses were aborted for the sake of getting their stem cells. But frankly, it's a fetus. And if you choose not to vaccinate yourself against Ebola because you're worried about fetuses, good luck to you. Meanwhile, in New Jersey, at the Howard Yoakum Elementary School in Maple Shade, New Jersey, a school has barred 2 students from starting class on October 20th, this past October 20th, because they came from the country Rwanda in East Africa. They are afraid that these kids may have contracted Ebola. Because, of course, we know that the Ebola outbreak in West Africa is only 2,600 miles away from Rwanda. They are taking the African students' temperature 3 times a day for the next 21 days. To see if they can return to school. This is just stunning. And the reason why this is important, I don't want to wade too heavily into the Sam Harris debate, but this is indicative of the same problem that people have with Sam Harris's contention that Islam is inherently problematic. It is true that Ebola is in Africa, and it is true that these kids are from Africa. But when you don't have that modifier, West Africa, East Africa, then you are susceptible to being an idiot. I mean, this is an elementary school where kids are supposed to learn something. And And you are basically wiping away everything they could learn about basic science, geography, not to mention just plain old bigotry. I mean, this is bigotry. And to say there's no difference between the health risk associated with someone coming from an Eastern African country, or specifically countries where there's an Ebola outbreak. And there may very well not be that much of a health risk associated with those people. But to say it's the same as the health risks of someone coming from a West African country is the same as saying there's no real difference between fundamentalists who practice Islam and people who just practice Islam or identify as Muslim. Same problem.
So you don't have the courage to acknowledge that Ebola comes from Africa. This is like literally the response that I've gotten to every single you making
There you
exactly
have
the
it.
same point.
And a little late to this, but not too bad. In terms of the Ebola hype, when there's some question as to why we don't have a vaccine at this point. And despite the fact that Ron Paul and the Libertarians are doing their best job of making a completely nonsensical argument as to how Ebola wouldn't be a problem if we would just let the free market handle it.
If you got rid of the National Institute of Health, you have 50 vaccines you could just choose from. They have different colors, different padding, and that's just how the free market.
There was no
freedom, liberty.
FDA. We would have so many. You could walk into your pharmacy probably and just pick a bunch of Ebola vaccines off the shelf. Well, here is Council of Foreign Relations Senior Fellow Lori Garrett on Meet the Press, explaining why it's ridiculous to blame the government for the lack of an Ebola vaccine, but more importantly, getting to the point of why we need government. Because there are, in some things it's more clear than others, but this is a perfect illustration of how the free market cannot solve a problem like a potential Ebola outbreak.
To find a vaccine. I mean, the bottom line is that the NIH still has about billions of dollars a year that it spends on finding a vaccine. I'm wondering, to what extent do you think the government is to blame for not prioritizing efforts to find a vaccine for Ebola?
Lori, why don't you take that? Yeah.
I think that's really grossly unfair, or at least it's targeting the wrong piece of it, because, yes, Project BioShield was created. The idea was to get incentives for industry to come up with vaccines and so on for Ebola and other key pathogens. And the problem was that no one could convince industry that it was in their interest to build up a huge stockpile of something that might never get used, might never get purchased. When did you imagine we would need an Ebola vaccine? So in fact, there was a vaccine center at NIH. They did develop a prototype possible Ebola vaccine, as have other sites in other companies and locations around the world, but there was no incentive to take it through the pipeline for commercialization.
Mike Murphy, you had a question.
Yes, it strikes me.
And frankly, you can go back and look at, this is the problem with privatization writ large. The reason why the buses were not sent on time to New Orleans to evacuate Katrina victims was because those services had been privatized. And not just the actual hiring of buses. I'm not saying the government should have had a fleet of buses that they owned. But even the decision to evacuate, to send the buses at the ready, had been subcontracted out. And so the fear that the subcontractor had, who had another subcontractor to actually deliver the buses, the administrative fear was, well, if we have the buses at ready and they are not needed, it's going to cut into our profits. The profit motive cannot address major societal problems. It simply cannot. And this Ebola is a perfect example of it.